All righty. Fire in the hole, gentlemen. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So real quick, I was kind of do the intro real quick, but myself, Scott Craig with Key Digital, and we have Mike Tinsberg, the man, the myth, and the legend behind Key Digital. And then today joining us is going to be Todd Cotter with Go Simply Connect. And a person I've been itching to get on here, other than Todd, is been Pete Coleman with PTS. Probably one of the coolest accents that I know. If you guys ever watch any of Pete's broadcasts. But basically today we're just going to kind of jump in and discuss some AV over IP situations. So before this started, gentlemen, I know we started talking and almost got too excited before anything came out. I don't know, Mike, Mike always comes up with the subject titles. So I don't know if you want to kind of lead off, Mike, or just have all of us kind of jump in because we all have our thoughts and opinions on this one.
Yeah. You know, as probably many of you know, we were supplying AV over IP connectivity products now for a few years, and we developed a lot of software and hardware around it. And we were in the direct connectivity, still are in direct connectivity of a regular kind now for, I would say, 20 years. I say HDMI connectivity since it's started, you know, like middle 15 years ago. And we were active in HDBaseT connectivity that when it popped out, and still are now for as long as it's around. We were actually helping HDBaseT to develop their product. They visited us very often. They like to talk to us. I was one of the, still is a member of the Emmy Award, and I was able to give HDBaseT an Emmy Award for the HDBaseT technology, which really changed. It changed for, as far as AV over IP, in my opinion, it has changed the world because all of a sudden we were able to use a structured cable for any audio video connectivity. You know, before it was, you know, remember all these games that people play, oh, my component cable, oh, my VGA cable, oh, my, you know, people were doing all kind of stuff. None of them was really stable, and especially for commercial environment was not really good until HDBaseT came out. And HDBaseT really made it solid. The structure while become a mainstream, you know, people who are used to do that cable for IT were in a driving seat. And as you know, the history, HDBaseT actually was derived from a straightforward IT format. It's actually a variation of 10G-based-T. You know, it's a standard. They changed that to fit point-to-point video connectivity over structured cable, but the basic underlying technology, the modulation scheme, the error correction scheme, everything that pushes high bit stream data from one point to another is from original IT standard. So that also makes it good because they didn't reinvent completely the wheel. They just adapted it for our market. Now, since then, I noticed there's evolution started, you know, slowly and steady. Even though HDBaseT use non-compressed format, like we call it baseband, direct connectivity, uncompressed data of up to 10G over the structure wire, which was perfectly okay for 1080p, perfectly okay for 4K 30 hertz or 4K 420 60 hertz. It does require a little compression when you go down to 18G format, which requires higher bitrate than 10G. So there's compression effect almost by factor of 2 or more to push it through that system. Still no problem for most of the installers. However, what also happened during this time frame, I noticed, is that the standard IT connectivity technology started to play into the same field. Now, structure wire, same. The only difference, HDBaseT, of course, doesn't go through IT switch. IT switch being a staple for any install for a variety of reasons, security, audio, you name it, you know, IT infrastructure. And so when people start to produce, like also we did, AV over IP, meaning we actually didn't use HDBaseT. Now we're using standard 10GBaseT format and compression associated with it to push video through standard IT infrastructure. Now with the addition of compression, we're able to do it in 3 different big segments. One lower segment is like H.264.265, high compression, low bit rate, 50 megabits or less. Then motion JPEG that uses 1G speed, which is looks like the most prolific IT switch out there, sort of the most commodity is 1G switch. And then there's a step up, which is what we just talked about, SDVoE, when 10G IP stream is used for switching around for this market. And we noticed, Scott and I, and in our company, we noticed that actually more and more people are switching to AV over IP, and they find it very comfortable once they get rid of original sort of nervousness of how do I set up and do it, what is it IP address, stuff like that, and how to make not competing IP, and have to use some of the IT tools when you go on switch. Once they get over that, and with the software tools that we provided and other companies provided too, it seems to be it became a mainstream. So from HDBaseT, a lot of people are very comfortable with AV over IP, which is standard structure wire communication with use of compression, low bit rate, 1G, 10G. So, and more I look into this area, and I can see that, it looks like almost everything that's throwing toward us in digital connectivity, digital displays, or any other connectivity AV project, it seems to me could be solved by AV over IP. So I wanted to get your opinions, get your market input, get your references from the field, throw it on the table and say, hey, is anything out there that needs to be not done for AV over IP? Can we do almost everything in the field with AV over IP? So this is sort of, I thought, to bring in this topic on the tip of all this underlying things that's happening.
Part of it, I don't know, before, I know Pete's ready to talk, but real quick. So on the sales aspect of it, real quick, is, and when Mike always asks us how comfortable everybody is, so some of these, residential guys, commercial guys, they're already doing the network, or some of the IT guys, because we have a lot of IT guys going, wow, you want to put this on my network? What's this black box do? Where is it looking? So it's so weird, and there's so many different directions. Any residential guy that's doing, a Control 4 Savant or whatever control system like that, it's network based. So everything needs to talk to each other. So now if they're just running a cat to each one of the TV locations, they're either putting, a decoder somewhere, or, a receiver, and just throwing that on the network. My biggest fear is a lot of these guys are like, hey, I'm not an IT guy. But everyone out there and all the other manufacturers are trying to work with everybody, to be able to say, hey, you don't have to be an IT professional. You do have to have knowledge, of what you're doing. But like what you were saying before, Pete, before we jumped in, is like how you've adapted and changed since you've, I don't want to say come over here, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's true. Obviously, in the last 15 years, so much has changed. And the discussion that we were having before we went live was the fact that I used to be a residential AV or technology installer and programmer. I used to do all that. And then back in 2007, I moved over to the dark side and became a consultant, but a consultant in the commercial space. And what I was saying was that it took me about 12 months to come up to speed, not on the technology side, but on the process side of how projects work in the commercial world, how things are done in the commercial world, how documentation is created, how coordination is done. Or there were so many other aspects where in the residential side of things, you would just go and do it. You did what you had to do and you just made it all happen. It doesn't work like that in commercial. So it took me sort of 12 months to come up to speed with all that. But also I've noticed a difference between the two markets, obviously coming from Asia Pacific region, where we've been deploying AV over IP. I mean, for 4 or 5 years, and it has become standard, stock standard for most, especially education institutions have adopted it very quickly. I remember, I mean, we did one of the first Crestron NVX rollouts at a university in 2017, I believe it was. So there has been that adoption over there or other parts of the world. I just haven't seen that same adoption here. Mike brought up so many great points there. I mean, we could unpack this for hours, but I think one of the biggest problems is standards. Like at the moment, we have no standards when it comes to AV over IP, except for AVB. Like when I say standards, I'm talking about ratified standards. We do have industry standards, which is more more of an adoption rate. Like obviously, Dante, once again, it's not a standard, but it's kind of that default transportation protocol for audio. And then you've got someone like SDVOE, who is kind of now the default transportation protocol. Because my biggest issue when it comes to any of this, I don't care who the manufacturer is, but like AV has continued to remain in silos on a whole. So like, Crestron's products are, good product, and Extron make a great product. But you know what? At the end of the day, they don't talk to each other. You imagine, you imagine if Cisco turned around and made some new telephone handsets, and they go, look at these beautiful handsets, look at all these features. Oh, by the way, they only work with our switches. Like it doesn't happen in IT world. And as we're transitioning into the IT world, we're not really adopting any of these standards that are available, which for me is so frustrating.
Where do you see benefit of and what standard you're looking for? For example, HDBaseT worked very hard to make it a worldwide standard. Mm-hmm. And they had certification program. They very, very, when you pay, we're a licensee, you pay their license, they do certification, they do all kind of things. And still, not many HDBaseT encoders, transmitter receivers are talking to each other besides basic. For example, if I plug in my transmitter into Epson projector, it will display audio video, but a lot of features that I bring and could be realized to 32 and RI and a lot of things, they're not compatible, and they will not work. So it's, where do you see benefit of our encoder talking to Crestron decoder on AV over IP space? Do you think we'll have a loss because we're changing our model every 6-8 months, so they do? It's going to be very hard to have a completely synchronous, everybody talks to everybody world, except the actual IT space, which it is standard.
Yeah, well, like I said, I mean, there is a protocol that only one company is utilizing, which is AVB, right? So, and I mean, I have this love-hate relationship there with Biamp. I mean, I love a lot of stuff. The way I love what they do, and it's I'm glad they've gone down that standards route. But when you're the only one, then you know what I mean. Like you're not compatible with anything anyway, even though you have using standards-based protocols.
Well, you kind of hit it before. So, on a consultant standpoint, so you could look at a project, right? Sometimes that hood's going to be welded shut before you could even open up, look at it. Mm-hmm. So it's like, okay, you're looking at the network switches. It could be Luxol. It could be this. It could be that. If that particular department, right, and I don't want to go on an IT tear here, but if that particular person is presenting this to you, you have now kind of decided, okay, what can I use as the infrastructure here? Because it's already been determined to me, which would be difficult, of saying, hey, it's going to be, brand X. And you're like, wow, okay, I could use brand A, I could use brand D, but I can't use, F and G because of the network switch. Mm-hmm. So it would be in a perfect world. I mean, we all, a lot of manufacturers, a lot of black boxes out there, but just knowing that it's not a plug and play scenario, and then Mike hitting it there. Hey, so and so does a firmware update. I mean, we all know, and I'm sure we could have a bunch of installers on here saying, "Hey, I just performed the firmware update, and it just crushed my system overnight." So I'm not, and like again, I'm not disparaging anybody, but so many times the hood's welded shut.
And I think, and that's okay, because the reality is, for most organizations, the most critical piece of infrastructure in that organization is the IT network. Yep. So if that's the most critical piece, then everyone else needs to plug in around it. And if that is AV or security or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. We need to work with that infrastructure rather than try and go around it. And that's my frustration, where a lot of manufacturers have always tried to go around it. And it's like, well, you try to go around it and you'll be blocked by the IT people.
But one of the things why I think AV over IP is actually gaining ground, in my opinion, considerable over HDBaseT, is because AV over IP is actually living on a standard IT infrastructure. It uses standard IT switches that are standard. It uses standard wiring that is standard. It uses a standard way of making the wire. I remember with HDBaseT, still remember when people ask us, how do you make the cable? We have to be sort of telling them that how to crimp the cables. When we use IT infrastructure, we have to tell them, look, use standard practice. Go to, people like Todd, he will tell you how to connect and terminate the cables. And we don't, we supply equipment that sends standard physical and format data over IT wire that hits that switch seizes data, and we will not be able to go through that switch if we wouldn't be standard. So as far as I'm concerned, AV over IP equipment from RG45 jack to RG45 jack through the switch to RG45 jack through to another piece, this is all standard.
Sure.
This cannot work if it's not standard.
Sure.
So that's one of the reasons I think why AV over IP is actually gaining in commercial space, because in 90% of it relies on existing infrastructural standard, which is IT, wiring, structural wire. Yeah. But that's why HDBaseT sort of fell short to get such a wide coverage, in my opinion, and still gaining as far as compared to AV/IP, is because it's not actually standard. It's a special narrowed format that needs special narrow, even though it can use 90% of what's, but it's not IT. You cannot plug. That's why when we used to call power over HDBaseT a PoE type format for a product, we never called PoE because we were afraid that some idiots will plug it into the switch, standard PoE switch, and expect it to work. So we call it PoH, to say power over HDBaseT. And now, power over HDBaseT has 12 volts, 6 volts, 9 volts, 24 volts, 40, you name it. But if you call it PoE in the world of IT, you can't do that. You use standard PoE, otherwise the switch won't see it and forget about it. So this is kind of a good standard environment. I think that AV over IP is created. We've actually, in using a free standard, thanks God, that PoE, that IT does not charge anybody for this, like many other companies do with a good standard. And that's why it's so wide, so prolific, used by everybody in the world, cheaply, and a lot of products become commoditized quickly, switches and stuff in that space. So I think we are in a standard space as far as I'm concerned. I think the standard beyond that could be crippling. For example, if I say, okay, you have to do 1G compression only that way, and that's the only way I will accept because of the standard, you know what happened? You froze the old method. It's like HDTV right now using MPEG-2. It was a hard compression developed and standardized for ATSC. It's crippling because all the TVs only see MPEG-2. Now we have H.264, H.265. There's so many things you can do, and it's hard. Now TV has to say, okay, we are standard, but we also open for non-standards. So it's kind of a what? So making anything beyond physical layer to make standard is danger. I think it's actually and slow down the industry toward developing new things, in my opinion. But I think the key point here is one of the key, I think, as far as the connectivity is cable. You know, how do these dealers, Todd, how do the dealers terminate? I mean, is it now known art? Is it you have to have a PhD in termination? How do you do that?
Here's real quick.
I'll be honest, I cannot terminate. Every time I try, it doesn't.
A good lead in for Todd, but Pete, I know that you were itching.
Yeah, so just two things on that, Mike, just quickly, is that whether it's HD based T or AV over IP or a direct connection, it depends on the application. So you're not, if we just require a point-to-point connection within the room, but you know, it's more than, say, I don't know, I don't really work in Imperial, but say more than 10 meters, then we may have a transmitter and receiver. We don't necessarily need to throw that onto the network to do it. We can, but we don't necessarily need to do it. So it's horses for courses. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. The other thing is that we take a slightly different approach when it comes to cabling. We do not allow the AV contractor to install any twisted pair cabling, regardless whether that is for HD based T, whether it's for AV over IP security, regardless. They are not allowed to do it. We design it. It goes into the communications contractor's scope of works, and they run it all on their behalf. So even if it is a HT based T solution, we are still using exactly the same infrastructure. They're terminated on patch panels. We use patch cables. Everything's exactly the same. The only difference is it doesn't run through the client's network switch. It's being patched into the matrix or the endpoints.
So a good lead in for Todd with Go Simply Connect. So anyone can jump on there, go through. Todd has some great videos of terminations. And I think that could be our number one service call, where either someone didn't use the right end or they used a pass through. So I want to let Todd jump in of what, like, kind of like, what do you have residential wise, commercial wise? Like, how do you think your dealers split? Because the only way to pull the AV over IP is obviously we needed RJ45 termination, you know, which I think a lot of guys, and I'm not making fun of anybody, that a lot of guys don't know how to complete. Or if you're doing 600 in a day, you know, you're going to have a couple bad ones, you know?
Yes, I agree. Mike and Pete and Scott, you've all hit on a lot of great points. I mean, yeah, standards in the IT world has been very stable, and the networks and the infrastructure has been rock solid for years, right? So it's a natural progression for AV to come on over to this platform, obviously, because of the the stability of the whole design. And yes, equipment manufacturers are having some issues with handshakes and different communication issues. But going back to the infrastructure and the cabling, you look at the RJ45, which is primarily the majority of all applications, all equipment manufacturers have adapted to an RJ45 connector, right? So that platform has been around since, I think, the 70s. Bell Lab introduced it for their telephone markets back in 73. I'm not trying to give you guys a history lesson, but basically, in those 40 some plus years, this platform has not changed. I mean, the form fit factor has been the same. It's still 8 pins, and it's when it was designed 40 years ago, it was designed mainly just to pass telephone signals and data primarily. So equipment manufacturers has created challenges for connector manufacturers like ourselves to create solutions. It was never designed to use power initially, right? And then as that has evolved, the actual form has not changed, but what our company has done is taken the technology and advanced it and created application designed products, right? So in the AV, commercial AV space, a lot of the big challenges we have with cable manufacturers, there's not standards there either. We're faced with as a manufacturer. So, there's cable size issues trying to fit a cable this size into a connector that's 1 inch and so you do have issues there. So there's not even standards in the cable industry. So we as a manufacturer have to adapt to those challenges. And one of the things we have done is obviously for the AV space, we mentioned plenum cable is typically being used and ran through all these applications. Well, our connectors, no one was really addressing that, but we've addressed our connectors to work with a plenum-based cable. So every connector we produce, whether it's for residential or commercial, is in that form UL94VO materials to work with all plenum cable as well as riser. It doesn't matter. So, and I think a lot of times we change the contact designs. We've done a lot of things. You mentioned troubleshooting issues. One of the things that we did, and we understand that because in connectors you have a connector design per cable type, right? So if you're dealing with Cat 5 or Cat 6 or Cat 6A or 7, you have a connector that's designed for that particular cable. And that's one of the things that we did is we actually color coded them based on cabling, because it's a common problem with an installer, installing the wrong connector on the wrong cable, right? So you're not getting the throughput that it's designed to do. And so that's one of the challenges, that the trouble, like the people that are manufacturers that are adapting to our standards, they use that color coding as an example with their troubleshooting. Okay, so this is supposed to be Cat 6A cable in the network. What color is the connector? Oh, it's blue. Well, that should have been a red connector. So, there's problem number one. So it's just the visual verifications that we can provide. And I think, standards is obviously a huge thing. We're challenged with converging on so many different markets. AV is just one of the challenges, right? You're dealing with, low voltage security, Pete brought that up. So, there is a lot of challenges. And I think, the industry is definitely adapting to new standards. Europe, Pete mentioned, we do a lot of activity over in the European markets, and they've been on this platform for years, right? And very reliable networks. So, so I agree with what everybody's saying. The challenges are there, but I think, it's going in the right direction for sure.
So Todd, why tell me, the structure wire termination is now for decades used. Why it still requires a skill? Why a person like me cannot just terminate? Every time I try, a couple of wires is not connected. I don't know why. And thread them correctly, it makes me so frustrated.
Yeah, well, Mike, I think this is another, maybe we should do a how-to video, another one of these discussions, but I could teach you to install a connector correctly in 20 minutes.
Okay.
How's that? So we'll save that for another time, because it'll be fun to do a hands-on demo. But one of the things we have is we obviously try to simplify the installation process. And, that's been one of our biggest strengths into the market, is creating, valuable processes. Like, one thing is, yeah, you're right. So you got to get those wires in a certain sequence and things like that. And you want to try to minimize the untwisted wire to really get you a solid termination. And this is, quite frankly, where a lot of the failure points come in from manufacturers, because they don't put guidelines and standards on the installs. I want you to use this cable, this connector, or these series of cables and these series of connectors. And, Mike, you mentioned it earlier, and you said, these products have been commoditized, a lot. And when that happens, quality degrades. I mean, you start dealing with, not the right gold not the right contact materials. And there's just a lot of polycarbonate materials. So what happens is, over time, the network's working great at the time of install, but little things, heat can destroy the material spec of the connector. And, then you got, truck rollbacks and other things associated with that. But yeah, the platform has not changed, but we have done a lot of improvements to especially work with power applications primarily. But yeah, I would love to reschedule and do a hands-on with you for sure. So
in saying that, Todd, I mean, whilst the platform or the theory behind it hasn't really changed, obviously we're trying to push more and more data across that cable. So the cables have become better. They've become more exact. And if we're using like HD-based T for an example, where, like Mike said, I mean, we can just push 4K over it, but, only at a, sort of an entry level, that's 10 gig right there. Now, to get 10 gig, every part of that installation needs to be spot on. The bend radiuses can't be exceeded. The cables can't be can't be damaged in any way. The terminations need to be correct. All these kinds of things, and the cable needs to be right. I mean, the cable is more exact. The twist rates, all of that needs to be in place for these systems to work correctly.
Like the biggest thing that always blows my mind is PoE lighting now. So now we're pushing voltage over that, you know? So it's like everything has to be spot on. And I think if all three of us went through right now and terminated a cable, and then we went through and ran a test on it, that we would all have three different answers. Yeah. You know, same length, everything else. It's just the, you know, integrity factor, this, you know, how the cable's being pulled, you know, there's so many intervals.
And one thing that we don't allow on any of our projects is field terminated patch leads. They all have to be factory terminated.
Yep.
And we specify all that. We work it all out. We do all that. But because once again, is that you're talking about, like, when something doesn't work, quite often the point of failure is that connection. Someone out in the field has terminated it either incorrectly or poorly, and then you have problems as a result. Just buy a freaking cable. Like, you know, like just get it factory terminated. It's terminated properly. It's tested. Plug it in. Like, don't be tight asses and try and do it yourself. Like, it's very frustrating. So that's why I'm saying we try and take all that potential room for error out of our projects by doing that.
Well, a lot of it too is, you know, between, you know, a lot of guys take pride in the racks. So when they're making their own ends, patch cables and everything else, they could dial it in perfectly, you know, make everything look good. So, I mean, you got your two sides there. So.
Well, I'm not here to let Pete put me out of business, because that's what we're focused in on, field terminated connectors. But I will say this: yes, you pat or punch everything down and use patch cords, but every time you have a connection, it's another point of loss, right? Even with patch cords and connectors, every time you do that, and you're doing that multiple times over the course of that network, you're going to create more and more loss opportunities. So a lot of times the installer loves to have a single home run, one line, two connecting points, and that's it, right? So our connectors and the value that they do bring is that we allow you to, first of all, we have pass-through designs. We have, you know, standard traditional designs. We have, you know, two-piece designs that allow, you know, to work with very large cables. So you can have to minimize the trying to push a large cable through a connector. So we have very unique designs. And then even with our pass-through, which a lot of manufacturers have looked down upon because it's been traditionally had some failure points in that platform. But what we did is we improved the contact design. We developed some new patented technology where we have, when the wires get crimped and cut off, they're exposed at the end. We actually have a cap 45 that actually snaps over the front of the connector, which seals it. So you get the convenience of the pass-through, which allows a guy like Mike to do this very easily, right?
Yeah.
Because everything is outside the connector. The wires go all the way through, you verify. And then when you cut, so people love that design, but so we give them the convenience of the pass-through with the security of a standard a sealed connector. So I'm
lost case, Todd. I'm lost case. I don't think you can teach me to wire.
So as we're thinking around the table here, is the original topic is how comfortable some of these guys are. I mean, I think we could all come up with 5 great reasons of why guys are uncomfortable. Pete bringing up a couple of valid points. Guys that are just like, hey, you know what? I got to have my my A-gay, you know, A-tech on that job because he's the best terminator. So it's difficult because I'm trying to think of like a good wording here of why guys are gun shy. You know, to kind of pinpoint it, you really can't, because there's so many intervals here. You know?
Yeah, but I think it's just a lack of education. I mean, the amount of battles I have on, you know, like on Facebook and AV Greatness, and these people are putting all these racks up there with a gazillion zip ties on them, and which is just like, I have these battles. You can't put zip ties on it. Use Velcro, right?
Yeah.
And it's just because they're not trying to do anything on purpose. They just don't understand. They don't understand the impact of what a zip tie does when it's too tight, for example. They don't understand of the importance or the consequences of a poor termination, all these kinds of things. And if they knew, I mean, there are organizations out there like Bixby is a great organization when it comes to cabling infrastructure. Go and do their courses, go and get educated, get certified, and then you'll understand it. And that's just on the passive side. And then you got the active side, which is a whole nother world. And you know what? We have a lot of knowledge in this area, but we don't, even ourselves, we don't have all that knowledge. So we need to work very, very closely with the client's internal IT people. And quite often all that information is kept at arm's length. We're not to know it, right? Because it's, it's for security reasons. But we become that conduit between the installers and the IT team, because we're interpreting what each other needs. But there is so much to learn. I mean, whether it's you're talking about on the security side of things, what needs to be configured with switches, all of that. There's a lot to learn. We're doing a project at the moment here in New York. We have about 23 virtual networks on there for all the systems that are sitting there, and primarily they're for security. So if there is a breach on one of them, it's not affecting the other. But there is so much we have to do. The architecture, we design it all, what's required, and everything is locked down. So they only get the bare minimum. Like if they need an internet connection, we have to open a firewall for them, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot to it, but it all comes down to education.
You know,
you touch
the sensitivity. Yeah, when with HDBaseT, since HDBaseT is always 10G, we actually, in order to support our dealers, we have coils and coils of different manufacturer cables, connectors, and we actually worked out a specific educational direction how to terminate, how to what wire to use and what not to use, how to coil or not coil, how to bunch or not bunch. All this comes from the fact that at 10G speed, this infrastructure is taxed to the end. It's very, very tough. If you send telephone conversation or 1 megabit per second over any wire, it will probably reach without any problem. But when you send 10 gigabit per second data, then everything has to be perfect from beginning to end. And that's why I think the 1G type AV over IP, which uses 1G is a 10 times less than 10G, is definitely practical and used so widely right now throughout the infra, and can lead to very large systems. Like you can cascade IP switches because they send a lot of data to each other, which is enough for this infrastructure. The cabling, the infrastructure, everything is much more reliable and easier to maintain than if you go to, let's say, an extreme, which is 10G, which is HDBaseT in the same boat, or 10G STVOE. It now requires more tough, more expensive switchers. The infrastructure cabling has to be perfect, and the cascading, I think it's definitely not doable unless you pay extraordinary price.
But that's how the projects are these days, Mike. I mean, all the switches that are going in on all of our projects, they're all 10 gig. The cabling is all minimum Cat 6A. So there is a 10 gig infrastructure for new projects in place. It's only the legacy projects that you kind of need to really worry about that. But, I mean, and also with HDBaseT, you really need a minimum of Cat 6A because you got 10 gig, and also you need a foiled cable because obviously the biggest problem with HDBaseT is near end crosstalk, where the cables at the source interfere with each other. So they need to be shielded in some way to try and prevent that. So by going to AV over IP, what it does eliminate is the requirement for a proprietary cable, because IT on a whole, depending on the application, maybe hospitals need shielded cables, but on a whole, you don't need shielded cables for IT applications. So once we go AV over IP, suddenly we're on the level playing field with all the cabling.
Right.
And part of it too, I see the big jump of as some of this content gets more insane. So we have our 4K, 8K, and it just keeps on climbing. So you're going to have to be 100% spot on, have the traffic flow, have the bandwidth. Everything is going to be 100%. If there's any flaw in an 8K, you're going to be able to, notice that right off the bat if you don't have the right infrastructure. So I got a lot of signage guys and stuff like that. They're like, hey, what about this? What are you doing now? So other than AVR over IP, it's the signage aspect of what's next. So every day something else is popping up and changing.
In saying that, I mean, bandwidth is bandwidth, and we do have a bandwidth limitation when it does come to copper. Obviously, when we talk about limitations, all the cabling manufacturers have to meet a minimum standard. So it means they can exceed it, but they have to meet that minimum standard. So regardless if you're talking about 4K or 8K or 1000K, it's going to have to be compressed within 10 gig.
Correct.
Right. To transmit it. So regardless of the resolution, it's still going to have a problem if you're running at the edge at 10 gig and it's not terminated correctly, or there's problems with the cable.
God forbid 1000K. I mean, please. Barely reached 4K. Now you're talking about 8K. Now you're talking about 1000K. I don't know.
Yeah, there are a couple of manufacturers that have obviously made that claim, and we've tested a lot of cables. We work with a lot of cable. We have alliances with a lot of different cable manufacturers. We certify their cables with our connectors, that type of stuff. But we like to use the analogy, as when we talk to equipment manufacturers like yourself, you're designing a lot of stuff in a lab, right? And it works in these great conditions. So we always say, you can build the best train in the world, but if you don't have the right tracks and they're not installed properly, that train doesn't go anywhere. So
I wish I would have a picture here of all the cables that we have in the lab that we test against, coiled in the most prohibitive way. And that's the way we release our product. If it goes through that crazy coiled, zip tight.
Oh, okay. So
we don't say it does this kind of a length.
So you do a real world test, which
we know we will learn our lesson. Originally, when HDBaseT came and said, use K5E, it's all work. No, it doesn't. You have to really be very thorough. But I want to switch a little bit to my original idea for this conversation, is that functionality.
Okay.
We talk about physical layer, and I think it's challenging, it's very important. But I would like to know, do you guys think, is there any application out there that cannot be solved by AV over IP? Is AVFP so wide-reaching that almost any digital signage or connectivity issues can be solved, or it has some limits on some applications?
Well, like I said before, it depends on the application. If I'm got a large room and I just want to go point to point, I mean, should I or do I jump through all the hoops and try and put something on the network? Because suddenly now I've got to go back to the IT department. I need to get that approved. There's a lot to go through for the sake of just going from here to there. So
but there are benefits of running through a switch. You can shut off power remotely on that switch and reset the equipment. You can extend the length. You can see if it's alive by logging into that switch. You sort of you are one participant on the wire. So it has some benefits of, you're right. Of course, you have to go through all these hoops. And by the way, if you go to that switch and if somebody connects a not orthodox router to it, which disrupts all the communication, then everybody's screwed on that switch.
Like Pete, did you ever run into it? Because we all know that now in AV over IP. So say we have some type of transmitter or receiver, we'll call it. Okay. Mm-hmm. So now we can go through and have a black box on this end, black box on that end. We all know right now that we could do some type of KVM capability. Okay. Because we can do USB over that single, switch. We can do, IP, IR, etc. So we're kind of like the cable company in a triple play. So now we're throwing everything on there. We've got KBM, PT, all our functionality is over that one single cable. In cable land, it's your phone, your data, and your picture if you got a triple play, and something's got to give. So can you, I'm trying to think of any particular project over the years that I could not have used an AV over IP solution. or a transmitter or a receiver to, like what would my roadblock been?
Well,
you know what I mean?
point that Pete mentioned, point-to-point connections, of course, are sometimes overshoot if you use AV over IP. You can use HDBaseT extender for a point-to-point, video audio of one point to another. That I understand. But your question is probably regarding overall functionality, right? Some larger point of switching or distribution.
I'll give you an example, Scott. So admittedly, they've changed their topology over the last couple of years, but typically universities in Australia and around the world, I've seen them deployed in exactly the same way in the US. They would have in-room systems because they don't want to have a centralized system. I'm talking about AV. So they don't want to have a centralized system where a matrix goes down and it wipes out 16 rooms, 32 rooms, because they need bums on seats in those classrooms to pay the bills, right? So all the design, the architecture around AV was all room-based. You would have some sort of box in a lectern, you would have the cabling running back to it, and nothing left the room. So once again, that's typically the architecture around the world. And it's only in the last couple of years, I know in Australia, where they've moved away from that, where they've turned around and they have gone AV over IP. But that's just one scenario. And that was only because of, to ensure reliability and uptime and not bringing down other rooms if there was an issue.
So in your experience, Pete, for example, if I have a 4x1 switch running as AV over IP system, and the switch, of course, has 48 more ports that are empty, and there are all kind of stuff plugged into that ports, printers and stuff. Is that doable, or people have a tendency to separate and put AV over IP on a network separate switch, or they mix and match freely?
If you're over this way, if you're ever in the city, Mike, I'll take you to a project that we're working on at the moment, where we have 3 stacks of switches, Cisco 48 port, UPoE 10 gig switches. And I think in total, there is probably 22, 23 of these switches in there. Every single device that sits on the network, regardless of the application, sits on those switches. And you'll have an AV device plugged next to a printer, plugged next to a PC, plugged next to an air quality monitor. Makes no difference. It's the back end architecture that is where it comes into play. It's how these networks are virtually set up that makes the difference. So we actually have to know what's on each port and assign it to a separate VRF. So they're all segregated and they have the correct rights and policies.
Yeah, I would love to go. I live in New York City, so if you take me there, I would be ready.
All right, anytime.
But so what about digital signage applications? Does AVIP covers every need? Every distribution net topology, every switching topology, every video wall, or it hits the limit at some point? Did you?
I don't think it hits any limits. I think once again the issue comes back to what IT will and will not allow on their network. That's what it comes down to. And I just touch on Scott's point before. He said, well, we can have a transmitter and a receiver and put them on the network. Well, if you take it a step further, most displays these days actually have a decoder built into them, albeit H.264, 265. Yep. So suddenly, when you're talking about advantages of AV over IP, suddenly I'm removing a box.
Yep.
Right. So from a reliability, from a cost, from all sorts of things, or various points of views, I think I'm improving that system as long as, admittedly, we're talking about H.265, but as long as we don't have a reference point, right, because there's going to be latency there, and as long as the picture quality is good enough for the application, then we're all good. So that's what gets me excited when we can do things like that.
Well, it doesn't get us excited because we don't sell that.
I get that. We're supposed to be having honest conversation here. Okay? All right.
Put us all out of business today.
Hey, I told you that's why I wanted to have Pete on. But but yeah, eventually it's
using a fiber cable doesn't get Todd excited.
Well, we are introducing fiber solutions this year. So
that's a whole nother subject, terminating fiber. I don't even want to go there.
Yeah. I want to tell a quick story there, Scott. I remember, oh geez, maybe 8 years ago, I think it was, maybe more. I was at a Crestron event in Sydney, and one of the key guys from Crestron US was on stage, and he was showing people how to terminate fiber. And I was just like, oh my God, like, what are you doing? Like, please just buy a cable, right? Like, just why you know what I mean? Like it's not easy to do. And there's so much opportunity for failure. Like, it only takes a speck of dirt or dust on a fiber cable for it not to work. And I was just like, oh yeah. Wasn't good.
This is another thing. You want to remove a box, and now you want to install crap.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Yeah, Pete's going to put everybody out of business.
I'm putting Todd out of business. I'm putting you out of business.
Yeah.
Someone still needs to design this mic, all right?
Obviously, we address the challenges with the field installation. I think that's really the biggest problem. Creating standards, having equipment manufacturers be more demanding on the process of the install. Just don't leave it up to an installer base just to make these decisions, because they're not properly trained. It's Pete, that's the biggest thing that I take away from Pete's comments. That it's all about education, right? And knowledge. And, a lot of times the installers are just comfortable staying status quo, right? I'm going to still put in an analog system or digital, whatever. And, so they're reluctant to changes, but, IT provides so many advantages with IP. I mean, Pete, perfect, and Mike, the remote access capability, I think, is probably one of the biggest advantages that it provides these installers today, right? There is a big learning curve that you have to go through and work with other departments with the IT, but I think the overall advantages long-term, I mean, it's scalable, it's, you're future-proofed. I think it makes sense just to continue to go down this path, right? I would not turn around and look to the future for all your installs. And
maybe I'm not in the field, but tell me why the structure cable remains the same diameter over the years, while, let's say, HDMI cable, there are all kind of offering now, because HDMI cable has structure cable inside. There's 4 twisted pairs there. Do people also, is there any, people also looking for thinner cables, or it's never the case?
There's different variations of cables out there. They're stranded, they're solid, which, if you do stranded cables, you're going to get a smaller jacket, right? But no, there is no standard in cable sizes. I mean, the variations is crazy. I mean, you go to, I don't have the actual dimensions, but I mean, you're talking very large diameter cables. And basically what it is, people are trying to get the bandwidth through a 10 gig cable. So they're using, 21 gauge conductors instead of 23 gauge, which is typically what is used in a Cat 6A. And, so with that becomes larger cable. So there is really no standards. Each manufacturer kind of develops their own cable in a lab under that creation. And then, accessory manufacturers like ourselves, we have the challenge of trying to adapt to all these designs, right? So,
I mean, they all have to meet a minimum standard. It's how much headroom is on the other side. So obviously, a lot of these manufacturers could just meet that standard by using a thinner gauge of copper, of wire. And then other manufacturers will say, well, look, hey, we will give you this much headroom. So I've got a lot of safety there. So, but as I said, they're all going to meet that minimum requirement.
Yeah, I use the draining the Hoover Dam with a garden hose theory. So you have all that information. The bigger the hose, the more we can pull out of it. Yeah,
exactly.
But it's almost like the monopoly of the neighborhood you live in might only be, FiOS. So if we were ever, and I'm not trying to get political, if we were ever to standardize this and narrow it down to, hey, if you're going to do AV over IP, it would have to be here, here, and here, and your choices were only those 3, it would create a complete riot because I think a lot of it, as we can go back and forth, Todd has a rapport with people over the years. People have Pete as a, you know, a rapport that their go-to guy is Pete every time. So you're always going to have tons of manufacturers with different bells and whistles and options because the person either standing behind it saying, hey, you know what, Pete's always steered me right. I'm bringing him in on these other projects. Sorry. You know, Todd always been behind there, always helped me out. So it would be really cool if we could standardize it, but you know, it's just
maybe
the reality of one big monopoly. It's like,
yeah,
hey,
I think it's just proper education. You know, teach them the right processes, make sure that they do pass standards, require them to do testing, right? I think that's probably a key thing that, you know, a lot of times they don't use a Fluke or ideal these network testers or certifiers. I think those are really.
Oh, they pull out their pair tester and I say, have you tested the cable? Like, yeah, it's all pass. I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, that's not what you want to do. In residential applications, you know, 99% of the time it's going to work just fine. But yeah, when you get into your commercial jobs, you need to invest in the right equipment to do the job properly, not only for your own sanity, but, you know, for your customers. You know, you want to have their comfortability. You want their, you know, you want to be a reliable source for them. So, you know, I always say invest in the tools of the trade. If you're in this trade, invest in it. And I know some of these testers are very pricey. I mean, they're, you know, you're talking 10, 15 and up, thousands of dollars, right? So, but it's a payback that's short-lived if you do your job right, you know.
So Pete, are you saying if I just have continuity check, that doesn't mean it passed?
No.
I'll find the sharpest object I can find and I'll chase you down, Scott.
But I mean, like education, you know, customer service, customer relations is, we all have something to offer across the board. And all we could do is just try to educate people. Everyone's got a different take on it, a different view. Like I said, there's thousands of black boxes out there. But if we can help everybody just that little bit to make it easier, then we all benefit from it, you know?
Yeah, so 100%. Like I said, I mean, and there's plenty of really good resources out there. So with cabling infrastructure, Bixby is a great resource. And then unfortunately on the active side, you've really got to go to the various manufacturers to try and do the training and so on. But once again, education, regardless of what we do, technology is always changing. So we should always be educating ourselves and keeping up to date with what's actually happening out there in the field so we can provide better service to our clients.
Yeah, what I mostly enjoy from AV over IP is this aspect that AV over IP is actually running on a very well established and mature technology.
Yep.
It's not yesterday, it's not the day before, it's now many decades, and it's not used in one or two locations, used in billions of locations worldwide. There's a good art behind it, good part supplying, good cables, good termination. So it really helps us because when you're not before AV over IP, you have to take care of the dealer from beginning to the end, including termination cables and everything. When you're in AV over IP, you can say, listen, you want a good connection? Just go for the best IT practice that's well documented through the switch that you use, through the wiring and the recommendation of all the connectors that people provide now for decades, and you will be okay there because all we do is just running on it. We're running our data on established infrastructure. So I think that one of the amazing things that we enjoy, even though we don't sell the switch today because it's essentially a commodity product, and we sell what's strictly video, which is transmitter and receiver and all the functionality built in there. We actually enjoy the fact that it became much more sort of standard fare is to set up AV over IP versus set up HDMI or set up HDBaseT. Even though I know that we still sell a lot of traditional products and price-wise, they're very competitive. You need a small 4x4 or 8x8 matrix. You buy $1, you buy 16 cables and you're done. You have to think about anything, and people definitely do it. But for more or less larger jobs, when you have asymmetrical warfare, less encoders, multi-coders, blah, blah, blah. When you have all this special video wall, multi-views, all the USB audio, all the things that needs to be also taken care of, AVIP is kicking the butt. I think it's definitely growing and becomes more and more popular. I think
I'm just surprised that the take up hasn't been greater here in my experience. Because it is the take up elsewhere around the world is, as I said, it's become the standard, regardless of what manufacturer they've chosen. It's become the standard in pretty much every university around Australia.
Except the US we're behind. That's what you
yeah. I was going to say, I don't want to sound like an anti,
Wait
American.
A second, isn't that why we imported you into New York?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
Yeah. Are
you the diplomat and the promoter of AVIP in New York area?
Apparently, I am. Yes.
Somebody has to be.
The check is in the mail. But not to sound like, I mean, from everything I've always read, overseas has always been ahead of us. You know, and I don't take that the wrong way. I'm not trying to get political or anything like that, but you could buy a refrigerator overseas and via Zigbee or whatever, and I'm not trying to get off topic, like your house knows that there's a refrigerator in it.
Hold on. Who brought iPhone to the world? Wait a second. Where's the iPhone?
There you go,
I don't think it came from overseas, my friend.
No, I understand.
Where was it made, or where did it generate from?
I understand where Scott's coming from, and I have a theory behind that, Scott. So I'll tell you, one of the most advanced countries around the world is actually New Zealand. So New Zealand and then Australia. And the theory that I have is that whilst a country like Australia is the same physical size or geographical size as the US, our population is only 25 million, and New Zealand is even less than that, right? Smaller place. So if you have these global organizations, if they're going to try something, they tend to try it in Australia or New Zealand, because if it doesn't work, it doesn't affect that many people or that many offices. So they tend to, they tend to sort of roll out the technology. All right, we'll try it here. And if everything works okay, and then we'll deploy it in the US. You think about it, if some of these large organizations in the US rolled out some new technology and it didn't work, the disruption that it would cause, but you don't have that same disruption in other parts of the world because it's just the physical size of that office.
That's
makes sense.
That's a great take. It makes 100% makes sense.
Wall Street endorsed, very advanced, Bloomberg terminals and software very quickly. It was very leading, I remember, proponent, and then it spread around the world. And financial business is the core of New York City. Let's say this is what most of our business is. So I think it's a mixed bag. I saw very aggressive proliferation of new tech in U.S. and New York area. It all depends, of course, on the money involved. I mean, Wall Street probably operates with different budgets than people who set up metric switchers.
So Mike, I have the most hated phrase that I hear in the industry, from my point of view, is when I talk to anyone in the industry and I say, "Why are you doing it like that?" And they say to me, "Because that's the way we've always done it." And I'm like, oh my God. Well, I'm sorry, that's not the way we're doing it moving forward. There's a reluctance to change.
You're a consultant, right? You're a consultant.
Yeah.
Right? Pete, unfortunately, that's what we hear from 99% of consultants. Every time we talk to them, that's what they told us. At the end, the dealers and integrators are a little bit more open-minded. With consultants, nah, that's the way we've done it.
You've been dealing with the wrong consultants, Mike.
Yeah.
Here you go.
I told you that's
why we imported Pete into New York.
Imported
in New York area.
Hey, that's why I wanted to have Pete on him, because it's open-minded. It's Pete's view. I mean, there's tons of people out there. There's a lot of people that don't want to color outside the lines. One thing I want to circle back to on education is, other than being book smart, we need to really enforce that street smart, because we could read about terminating cat fibers, everything else. It's the hands-on. I wish some of these other, testing and educational people actually had a physical hands-on part, because you all know we could read something and then quiz each other and know the answers. So maybe we could absorb it there, but the actual implementing it in the field is what the biggest difficulty is. For a lot of guys with the AVRIP, they're like, hey, I can't do this. I can't.
So
it makes sense.
In education, they have a tendency to do installation by their own. That's why we need to educate them. They don't use dealers and integrators.
No, I'm just saying the whole book smart, street smart aspect. So you could read a bunch of information and you absorb it, Mike, right? Like you as an engineer, you could write a manual for something that would look totally different than three of us writing out a manual. You know what I mean? So you could, it's a lot of guys just can't translate that from the book smart. And I'm not mocking anybody, because there's tons of guys that are really good at doing it. But it's like, I wish there was a physical hands-on testing aspect, because we can all ace in a CTS and a VIXA class or whatever, because we just absorbed it and relayed it, you know what I mean, into a test.
And I know, I'm sure there is over here in the US. In my experience, all the cabling manufacturers have hands-on training. And if you want to be certified for that manufacturer, you need to go and do it. You need to actually terminate cables and test it and do that before they'll actually give you a status that allows you to give higher levels of warranty, for example. So if you're at the base level, you might only be able to give a 10-year warranty for your client. But if you jump through all the hoops and prove that you're a master installer, then okay, you can give them a 20-year warranty, a 25-year warranty, whatever it may be. So yeah, I'm sure the same thing applies over here.
It's just a lot. I don't think we have enough hands-on here.
Right.
You know what I mean? Versus like some of the videos that Todd does where, they go through and terminate it just to see, showing people how to do it. But yeah, I would like to personally see more hands-on experience. So when you're putting,
I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Todd.
I was saying, I think a lot of manufacturers work within their own silos, right? They just live in their own world, and we're guilty of that ourselves, right? We put our own reps out there to train the dealers and distributors alike. Obviously we would do the digital and social media to try to get the information out there. But, one of the things that I think is great, that I see a lot of more collaboration going on in the market here, because people are faced with so many challenges, and we're all about trying to join as many organizations as we can, whether it's HD, HT, SD, BOE, whatever. We want to help bring solutions to the market, right? And I think the willingness, if people will kind of get out of that silo and try to help everybody, I think that's the real key. And, I think the market is adapting that way now. I see it more of that happening, like you inviting us here today. I mean, that's a collaboration that, may not have happened years ago. So.
Yeah, that's what part of AVRIP, we need the collaboration of everybody.
Yep.
Especially people who provide the back-end infrastructure.
Because everybody has a view, everybody has an opinion, So
how much time do we have? Is it?
I was going to wrap it up, because I'm sure Pete and Todd have multiple events, being that we're going on for an hour today. So I wanted to give, Todd a moment and Pete a moment to kind of recap what they got going on, other than kind of wrapping this up some, because I know you got a full plate, Mike, and in the sales world, it's end of the month.
All those statements are true. So, but no, first of all, Scott and Mike, I really appreciate you inviting me and letting me be part of this discussion. It was very educational for me as well. So I learned a lot. So I will say, I don't know if you're going to provide contact information for me to the field.
Yeah, I'll go through and add more stuff to the video. So real quick, not to interrupt Todd, but myself and Todd, I always stay in contact with Todd, because I was with a manufacturer. We were at a trade show. I ran over to him. He had a solution. I was like, hey, you know what? I'll buy a lunch if you can have these guys run over here and tip this for real quick, as we were setting up a booth. So
yeah. That starts at 8 o'clock the next day,
yep.
Right? And by the way, Scott, I never did get that lunch.
Yeah. All right.
But so I mean, I'm putting myself out there. If anybody has any questions or has any installation needs or concerns, I'm here making myself available and my team available to you. So,
thank you.
Yep.
I just wanted to echo those thoughts and thank you, Scott, for reaching out, and thanks, Mike, for having me on the on this show. And it was great to meet yourself, Todd. I mean, great discussion. And for me, the takeaway is education. Like, educate yourself. You can never know too much. And there are a lot of resources out there. You just need to just ask the right questions. And to your point, Scott, is go and do it. And I think a problem with a lot of consultants is the fact that they have done all the theory, they've done all the training, but they've never done anything hands-on. They don't know how things are actually installed. Go and do a cabling course. Go and actually do it yourself, right? So you understand what you're designing. And I think that's really lacking, is that in theory, everything works on paper, right? Everything works on paper. Nothing on paper has ever failed. It's not until you install it that the issues come out or apparent. So if you can have more practical hands-on knowledge and experience from a consultant's point of view, then you're going to be streets ahead of the next person, of your competitor. So, and all that is just education. So.
Perfect. I appreciate your gentlemen time. We're going to go through and end our live session here. I'm going to put everybody's contact information there so you can reach out and contact either Pete or Todd for additional information. And I appreciate everybody's time in today's broadcast.
Thank you, guys. It was
no worries. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks.